Order that the bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. Orders of the day. Oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 12:33. We will finish at 1:33. And I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education met with school boards on February 14th of this year to give boards their funding targets. 5 boards were told they would see funding cuts of nearly $5 million in total. This is, of course, on top of the $31 million that was cut in funding, Mr. Speaker, and the $34 million in inflationary costs that the government has downloaded on the boards. So my question to the Premier, can the Premier tell parents, students and teachers how much money his government has cut out of public education in the last 3.5 years?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what we have done is increase the amount of per-student funding in education now to its highest levels in history. We have, of course, gone through some very, very difficult times in this province where there simply is not the money available to do what was done in the past. So we have sought to work with the boards in order to ensure that their funding is appropriate to be able to deliver the services that the young people of our province need and deserve. And we intend to continue to do that. We asked them, and I know that the boards have worked away at taking that money out of administration so that it would not come out of the classroom. We would like to, of course, encourage them to continue to engage in that kind of appropriate budgeting.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know of a board in the province of Nova Scotia that feels like the government has actually been working with them in the best interest of kids, Mr. Speaker. Since taking office, Mr. Speaker, the Premier has seen $76 million cuts in public education. Over 700 teacher positions have been cut thanks to this government, and another 170 being cut in this budget cycle alone. Schools are going without maintenance work, and young children are having to spend hours to get to and from school. On the flip side, Mr. Speaker, the cost of power has gone up 30% under this government, and school boards have reported power bills $1 million, Mr. Speaker. $1 million in power bills alone, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier tell those parents and teachers what he expects boards to eliminate because of this direct funding cut to school boards? More teachers, student supports, maintenance, buses, which one?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to correct the information from the Leader of the Opposition. No teachers have been cut from our system. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we are adding in more teachers as a result of increased funding where they are needed. We have instituted class caps on class size to ensure that, and hired more teachers in order to make sure that that has happened. In addition to that, Mr. Speaker, we are building new schools in communities throughout the province. Mr. Speaker, we are providing Nova Scotia students with the best quality of education. We are working with our partners to ensure that that takes place. We are doing that under one of the most financially challenging periods in our province's history. But the good news, Mr. Speaker, as evidenced by the budget this year, is that we're turning the corner. There is, in fact, because of the good financial management of the province, there is now more opportunity for us to be able to extend services, and we intend to do that.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Speaker, it's very clear what we've seen under this government is a direct attack on public education, Mr. Speaker. This government has tried to balance the books on the backs of our children, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are 700 teaching positions that have been eliminated since this government has taken power. Mr. Speaker, and then when school boards go about doing what is their responsibility when it comes to looking at their infrastructure, when they look at whether or not to close schools, Mr. Speaker, they go through the gut-wrenching experience of asking parents, teachers and community members to come forward to make a concrete decision about what they can do. This minister interferes in that decision, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, but not only, Mr. Speaker, does the minister interfere, Mr. Speaker, she interferes but says no new money, Mr. Speaker. So I want to say directly to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, when the South Shore Regional School Board is being forced to keep open the Gold River Western Shore Elementary School that requires a $100,000 new roof, where does he expect that board to get the money? Is he prepared to pay that bill?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the question, I guess it was a question that was asked by the Leader of the Opposition, contains inherent contradictions, and I know that they're happy with that. But the reality is that this is a leader who told his own annual general meeting that he was happy with the engagement that had taken place, that he thought the model actually worked, despite the fact that it has been community dividing, adversarial, despite the fact that communities across the province have said that this is not the manner in which they want to handle this. And further, Mr. Speaker, he talks about the idea of interfering in a process when you have a minister which is actually listening to the people of the province about the concerns that they have, and who is going to the boards to say, in the context of the decisions that you're being asked to make, would you delay these decisions so that we might work with you in order to develop a better process, one that has a better process for bringing communities together rather than dividing them, Mr. Speaker? I don't see that as interference. I see that as responsibility.
Order, please. I am about to break a long-standing tradition about introductions and question periods. I feel that it's necessary. We have a very important dignitary that's joined us here today, so I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party to do the introduction, but I will add a minute to question period.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my great honour as Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party to introduce to the House the 21st Premier of Nova Scotia, a man whose wisdom all Nova Scotians remember and still refer to his snippets of wisdom as bacon bits, the Honourable Roger Bacon.
Thank you. We welcome all our guests to the gallery and hope that they enjoy this afternoon's proceedings. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his question.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is this. Nova Scotia is, as we discussed, making national and international news this week for very sad and tragic reasons. But together we now do have a moment where we can truly make news in a more positive way by being a leader in the prevention of bullying and cyberbullying here at home and show the rest of the country how to do that. One of the recommendations of the McKay Task Force on bullying, Mr. Speaker, was to teach digital citizenship in our schools, to actually place it on the curriculum so that all young Nova Scotians know both the rights and the responsibilities that they now have as citizens in an online and digital world, that they can use those tools for the good that they are meant to be and learn not to use those tools in a destructive manner. And so my question to the Premier is, will he agree to place digital citizenship on the school curriculum as soon as possible, as recommended by the report? And I'll table that page of the report for the Premier.
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This recommendation, of course, was accepted by the government and, in fact, is embedded within the curriculum of the schools and, in fact, starts, as I understand it, in grade primary.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Premier for that answer. Mr. Speaker, the government has not incorporated all of the recommendations of the McKay Task Force, even though it was the result of over a year of consultation and discussion with both experts and those that are involved in protecting our children. For example, the task force did provide a definition of cyberbullying that could be placed into provincial law to ensure that those that engage in bullying and cyberbullying know both what it is and the consequences of committing that offence. And so I will ask the Premier, will he now commit to defining cyberbullying as an offence in provincial law, including spelling out the consequences for those that engage in it?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we have looked carefully. We have implemented those recommendations in the task force that we felt were capable of being implemented, those that we considered needed more study. That is certainly underway. Certainly the committee will have the opportunity to go back and revisit that report, and we intend to move forward very, very quickly. As the Leader of the Conservative Party would know, Nova Scotia, in fact, up until this point, has been a leader with respect to bullying. We are the ones who had the first bullying task force, and we move forward accepting the fact that the system technology is constantly changing, which means that we have a responsibility to continue to modify, continue to learn what the consequences of these technologies are, and to do something about it. And that is the commitment that the government has.
Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again I thank the Premier for that answer. The need to implement all of the recommendations of the McKay Task Force is now stronger than ever, and so I would encourage the government to not merely study the study any longer, but get on with reviewing all of the recommendations and putting them into practice, Mr. Speaker. As I will ask the Premier as a result. The McKay Task Force included some recommendations around giving school officials and other responsible figures of authority all the tools they need for a greater early intervention when they see bullying or cyberbullying taking place, to give them the tools to actually intervene in time to stop it in its tracks. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask the Premier, will he commit to implementing all of the recommendations of the McKay Task Force, including those that specifically address early intervention tools?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want him to know that the recommendations that have been accepted have all been implemented, including the one that he mentions. The fact of the matter is that the teachers have had in-service in order to be made aware of the supports that are available. They have. This has been part of rolling out the information they need in order to be able to support students who they may identify as having difficulty. The leader of the Conservative Party may also know that with respect to these matters, that many of those recommendations would have to involve the federal government, the areas of jurisdiction that belong wholly or partly to the federal government. And I, for one, completely agree that this is something that should demand. Nova Scotia is a small jurisdiction. We are a caring jurisdiction with respect to the people, with respect to our citizens. But there are some matters, there are some areas of work that needs to be done that really extends beyond the boundaries of our province, and so there needs to be attention paid to this by the by the House of Parliament, and of course we will work with them, not only give them the benefit of the work that we've already done, but to assist them in any way we might to address the issues that we now find before our House.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Education made her early years announcement. Sadly, nobody was surprised when we soon realized it was more hype than substance. But keep tuned in, there will be more to come. A brief issued yesterday at the announcement notes that early years centres, wherever they will be, whenever they will be established, will work with early intervention programs. So my question to the Minister is this. Can the Minister of Education tell members of this House today how much government currently spends on early intervention programs?
Of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We're in transition with our new Early Years Department, and the information about the early intervention is moving over from the Department of Community Services, so I won't be able to answer that because that's not over in my department at this time. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I will tell the House. $2.9 million is currently being spent on early intervention, so perhaps the minister could check that out. There are 900 families already getting support from 17 agencies, but those agencies are maxed out. In fact, on top of supporting families and facing growing wait lists, early intervention programs have to fundraise as part of their service agreements. But, Mr. Speaker, children are aging out of the program while they're waiting for service because this government has not funded them properly. So my question to the minister is this. How can the minister expect that parents will believe early years are a priority for her government when they can't even yet properly fund the services that are in place?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I know that parents and stakeholders across the province were very excited with the announcement yesterday of the integration of all the aspects of early years being under one roof, and so I look forward to working with the stakeholders and with our communities as we integrate our service to meet the needs of our youngest citizens. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, parents and those who were at the announcement have a right to feel concerned when this minister says that something is her priority. For example, she said cyberbullying plan was a priority, and we know what happened to that. She's putting impossible demands on school boards to choose operations over programming while she guts their funding. Her cuts to education will begin when students are continuing to wait for speech language and school psych ed assessments. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister, why should parents believe this minister is making education and early education a priority when she consistently lets children and families down?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to stand here that as a government we are addressing areas that the other government was unable to address. I know that we have taken the issue of bullying and cyberbullying as a task force, and we are the government that have went out and we've consulted with Nova Scotians. We've been out in focus groups all across the province with our early years. This government is addressing the needs of our youngest citizens and addressing the needs of our students across this province. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the past couple of days, Nova Scotians have been flooded with a set of announcements which produced lots of photo ops, but were light on details. Proof in point, the insulin pump announcement, which is a good announcement. Instead of providing specifics, we got a press release which reads, and I quote, "The province expects to begin taking applications by July 31st. And I will table that release." Mr. Speaker, that sentence doesn't instill much confidence. Given the press release was issued by the Premier's office, could the Minister of Health and Wellness please confirm whether applications will be available and accepted by July 31st, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member being at one of those photo ops with the Premier and I. I know he's very interested in the insulin pump program, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the member approving and supporting the budget so we can move forward to implementing this service.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This caucus is happy this government came to its senses, funded insulin pumps, although it should have happened 4 years ago. While Tuesday's announcement spoke about taking applications, it was silent on when the insulin pump program will be up and running. Could the minister please tell us how long applicants will have to wait for their insulin pumps once applications are accepted, which may or may not happen by July 31st?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Children's health care is very important to this government, Mr. Speaker. That's why we are reinstating a program cut by the Liberals under the dental care for children, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're introducing an insulin pump program here in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. I know the young people that were in attendance of the event the other day are extremely happy, Mr. Speaker. We're going to work as quickly as we can to ensure that we pass the budget and that we implement the program as soon as we can. And I know Nova Scotians are looking forward to that program to be up and running here in the province, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, we are all mourning the death of Rehtaeh Parsons. I know in Inverness I've had many calls and emails from people in Inverness County who are feeling terrible about the situation. The minister said yesterday that he would consider strengthening legislation around the distribution of disturbing graphic images. This is an important step. May I also suggest we have a need for laws that allow for early intervention. My question for the Minister of Justice: will the minister give school officials and others in positions of authority the necessary tools, such as having the ability to remove cell phones, to allow for early intervention on bullying?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for his question. And I just want to further the minister's statement, the Premier's statement earlier this afternoon, in regards to the strategy that we're putting forth with my colleague in the House, the minister responsible for the status of women, who will have responsibility over putting a collaboration, a collective voice from a cross-section of all Nova Scotians to look at how we best address this. I also want to point out to my colleague there that I've written to my federal colleague, the Honourable Robert Nicholson in Ottawa, and expressed my concern to help expedite some of the work that we have been doing in regards to this matter, and I've asked him if I could meet with him on an urgent basis in regards to this, and I'll table this letter for a matter of record. I just want to point out to all Nova Scotians that the issue of bullying is something that I personally take to heart in a commitment, and that I, as the Minister responsible for justice, am fully committed to this, and we as a government are as well.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've met the federal minister myself, and I know he's been a champion for victims of crime, so I'm sure he'll be taking you up on that. Mr. Speaker, we need to allow our legal system and our schools to have the tool of early intervention so that these situations don't escalate to such devastating degrees. The McKay report recommended we adopt a model similar to that of the Domestic Violence Intervention Act. My question for the minister: will the minister make intervention a priority to guide our young people away from hurting others?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you. I want to thank the member again for that question. Absolutely. I'm committed, our government's committed, and it's a matter of getting education for our young people to be aware of the respect for one another, to know the boundaries, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, but as well to deal with the cultural lag that's occurring in our society, where technology is moving faster than the culture can adapt. And what I mean by that is that the technology out there, that the consequences of our pictures and the impact that has, and the awareness. And so the education that we need to do needs to be extended, and we're fully behind that. And that's why, once again, I'll reiterate the strategy today to put a minister responsible to focus that energy and to take that collective voice to try and make a positive difference in our province, to not have a repeat of what's occurred this week.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And there's no question bullying has been with us since the dawn of man, no doubt. And certainly it has taken on a new face with and the member has corrected me rightly so, the dawn of men and women. But my point being that, as an agreement with the minister, that technology has put a whole new reality around bullying, and I think the minister has answered my question favorably, and I thank him for that. The point being that if people in schools and public places where young people are when they're away from their parents and their homes have the ability to use measures to remove those electronic tools when they're being used to bully others, I think that is a good thing. So, Minister, I think if we're in agreement here, I'm going to avoid asking a second supplementary and allow the Speaker to carry on with question period. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal earlier this year issued tenders for aggregate to carry out single chip seal paving in the counties of Richmond, Inverness and Victoria. That work was to be carried out this summer. Mr. Speaker, this week on Monday, April the 8th, these three tenders were abruptly cancelled by the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. Speaker, bidders on the tenders were given no notice of the change prior to Monday's announcement. A lot of work and effort goes into preparing these bids, and private businesses in the counties of Richmond, Inverness and Victoria were looking forward to some much-needed work for local truckers. My question is, will the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal advise the House as to why these three tenders were cancelled so abruptly?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend for the question. Yes, as in any process that we undertake, there's a procurement policy that we follow. And tendering is the way we go. In this particular case, the tenders were issued, and when they were returned, they were significantly higher than what our anticipation was for that project, and for what the budget was we were considering would be appropriate for that project. So we have cancelled those tenders and are trying to find ways of providing the aggregate needed in another fashion. Now, I can tell my friend opposite that our intent is to fully complete the work that we had indicated we were going to undertake in Cape Breton this summer, and that will happen. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're pleased to see the work is going to be carried out, but the question becomes, how is the department going to get this aggregate if it's not going to a tendering process? The minister has indicated that they've respected the tendering process and that's how they operate, but now that you've cancelled the tenders, how is it that the department is going to move forward in obtaining this aggregate if the tender process has been cancelled? So basically my question to the minister is the minister stating today that they will be obtaining this aggregate by picking and choosing who they want rather than respecting the long-standing tendering process that's been in place?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you. Again, I thank the member for the question. In this particular case, we will be, as I said, I can assure the member opposite that the appropriate measures will be taken to assure that the work that we have scheduled in Cape Breton will be going forward. I actually met this week with the members from the Road Builders Association. They raised that issue with me. We explained to them what the situation was, why the tenders were cancelled at this particular time. They understood the need for us to be careful in terms of the monies we spend and to look at whatever options we can come up with in order to provide the materials necessary to get the job done. And at this stage, that's what we're doing. If we can come up with a method that's going to provide us with the aggregate at a more reasonable price than the tenders provided, then that's the route we will go. Obviously, if there isn't a source that's going to provide us to that for us, then we will be back looking at those tenders again. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure what message this sends to all the bidders out there as to the work that they put into the tendering process. If the minister can simply turn around and say the tenders are too high, we're just going to go and buy it from where we can find it cheaper. why do we have a tendering process in the province to start off with? And I know that the minister is looking to find as cheap as possible, and the government has somehow painted the road builders as big bad wolves here, but let's keep in mind that there are also local truckers, small independent businesses that were relying on this work from the larger road builders that are now out of work. So I guess my question is, if the minister is going to go and cherry pick who he's going to buy the aggregate from, will the minister indicate whether local road truckers are going to have the opportunity to be part of this work, or is it all going to be carried out by whoever they buy the aggregate from that they've handpicked?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'll tell my friend that as much as possible, of course, because it's an advantage to us to use local trucking because of the distances involved and that kind of thing. So as much as possible, yes, we will be using local truckers to haul the aggregate when we get it to where the site is going to be. My understanding is that there will be a number of dumps in the area that the aggregate will be placed. Obviously, as close as possible to the work that is going to be done, but local truckers certainly will be involved in moving it from those sites to where it needs to go. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development avoided answering my question about our government's future plans for funding private and non-profit child care centres. I've now stood in this House and presented 9 examples of the NDP saying one thing and then another on the issue. So my question once again, Mr. Speaker, through you, will the Minister finally tell members of this House if her department is reviewing the funding model for child care centres?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm really looking forward to working with we're developing a provincial early years partnership, and I'm really looking forward to working with our stakeholders in this area, because there's been a lot of studies done over the last number of years, and there's many issues that we need to work together and move forward with. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the government has changed its tune on this issue 9 times in 16 months. They continue to keep parents and small business owners guessing. The government's plan will have impact on hundreds of small business owners and thousands of families. People deserve to know what the NDP plans to do. Mr. Speaker, I tabled for the Minister yesterday the answer from the Standing Committee on Community Services, where the Deputy Minister of Community Services said there was no plans to review the funding model. Yesterday, the Minister told reporters there was, and I had the news article to prove that, and I'll table it, Mr. Speaker. So my question through you to the Minister, what childcare funding changes will the government be making?
Good question. The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I am very pleased to say that the Nova Scotia Child Care Association were at the announcement on yesterday, and they are very pleased with our announcement. And the person that's in charge of that, Ms. Couture, who I met for the first time yesterday, Caitlin Couture, agreed with the minister, stating that the good work that is happening already in the delivery of childcare, building on that, addressing gaps as identified, was a positive approach. Thank you very much. And I will take
The Honourable Member for Victoria Lakes on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But the group also says at that same article that I presented that the devil is in the details, so I guess we have to wait longer for that. Mr. Speaker, there are communities across this province with only one childcare facility. In many cases, that childcare centre is run by a small business owner. The government cannot continue to be so secretive about what their decisions will mean to Nova Scotians. Nova Scotians need answers, and they deserve an apology. So my question through you to the Minister, why does the Minister continue to veil her government's intentions and speak out of both sides of her mouth?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. And I would like to just say that in all of my delivery, I always try to be as respectful as possible to every member in this chamber. And I would like to say that I'm a bit offended by the comment that was made, and I would like to stand on record that there's no need for us to, considering the situation we're dealing with in terms of bullying in this province, but I would like to say that I am offended. I will answer the question, though, Mr. Speaker, because I see what I would like to say that coming from the release from the Nova Scotia Child Care Association, that they're looking forward to applying the wealth of expertise and experience that they have in planning and delivering and sustaining quality in early learning and child care services available. There we're working together as we move through this process. Again, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much.
The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, Straight Area Transit provides an essential transportation system for residents in the town of Port Hawkesbury in the counties of Richmond and Inverness. On March 25th, Straight Area Transit suspended its operations due to financial concerns. Mr. Speaker, it's now been over 2 weeks that this service has not been in operation. People have had to cancel medical appointments and miss other appointments as well because of the suspension of the service. Could the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations advise the House as to what the status is of negotiations to resume the operations of Straight Area Transit?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think when the member asked a question on this topic a couple of weeks back, I indicated that my staff were intending and trying to set up a meeting with stakeholders in the area, which included the representatives from the municipalities involved. So that meeting happened yesterday, Mr. Speaker, and I haven't yet been briefed as to the outcome of that. I want members to know, and the member opposite for sure, that my staff did go with a proposal, around what we could offer from the province in terms of funding, and I want this would be short term in the hopes that they would get to a long-term solution. The issue around people's appointments and whatever, we also fund the Straight Area Transit money through a door-to-door program, which is actually the way we fund other transit associations in the province. We don't fund fixed route, but because Straight Area has a combination of the two, so I think it would be up to them to try to ensure that, because we fund the door-to-door so people can get to their appointments, that would be an aspect of their program that they see to it that they maintain. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I can't encourage the Minister enough to look at this as an emergency situation. When you've got people missing important medical appointments because of this loss of service, you have students that attend the Regional Occupation Centre in Port Hawkesbury that are being disrupted as well. People came to rely upon this service, and I know the government has indicated how it sees this as an important service. So I would hope that the Minister would see this as an emergency situation and be prepared to put the funding necessary in place while a long-term solution is being carried out, because as we talk about this, we have riders that do not have a means of transportation, and that needs to be addressed. So my question to the Minister again is he prepared to put in place emergency funding to get Straight Area Transit up and running as soon as possible?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, that was the game plan that my staff went down there with. It was the idea that we would use our envelope of funding that we have to help them in the short term until a long-term solution could happen. I think the member is aware that the province gave $120,000 last fall and another $5,000 a couple of weeks back. And we were not informed about the impending shutdown of service. We do not fund fixed route transit, Mr. Speaker, and it's my expectation that we will not be funding this into the long term. Thank you.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the residents straight area listening to that are a bit confused about door-to-door and fixed route and funding. So let me make the answer as simple as possible, and hopefully the minister can make his answer as simple as possible. How much money is the minister and his department prepared to make available to straight area transit today to restore that service?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you. I can get that number probably for the member before the end of the day. It would be what is in the envelope for that programs that we traditionally offer. And the reason for the meeting with the stakeholders, and in particular the municipalities, is that fixed transit is funded through municipal units and not through the province, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's good to stand and ask this question once again. Over the last number of sessions, I've pretty much asked this question almost every time to the Minister of Economic Development. The issue of the remaining creditors from the fallout of the closing of the Southwest Shore Development Authority. As you know, a beautiful school community centre was constructed in the village of Tuscott, a great model of rural development that's well used by a Acadian community. A place to gather, a place to celebrate and maintain our distinct culture and heritage. But a cloud still hangs over the remaining $400,000 that is owed to the local contractor, Garion Construction. Will the minister review this once again and help find a solution once and for all in order to get Garion Construction paid?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the member for the question. And first of all, I've got to say is that as an entrepreneur myself, been in business for 23 plus years, is that when you're owed money, you like to be paid. And I know that as an entrepreneur and as an individual, and I'm sure that there are many members of the House have seen in our days some debts that weren't paid, money owing to us. And one of the problems we have with this case, this instance, is that monies were paid out by the provincial government to take care of that debt. And certainly I agree with the member opposite, a nice facility, a great facility down there. And we did fill our obligation when we were asked by SWASDA to look after that debt, and we did that by writing the check.
For Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank the minister for that answer. Even though, really, when you look at it, I'm not asking that the minister go and write another check to try to pay for this. What I'm asking for him to do is to sit down with the local councils, maybe with some local business people, and sit down with Garion Construction to see if there's a solution that can be found. Many times we've heard that maybe litigation is the only way to go on this, but the difficulty we had all along with Garion Construction, the school community centre, is the fact that it is a Crown-owned property. It is attached to a school, and therefore a lien couldn't be put on it and be very difficult to litigate that way. So again, my question to the minister is, will the minister listen to the pleas of local area and Garion Construction and commit to finding a solution?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I said yesterday, I proclaimed that I'm one of the most accessible ministers in government, and I will reiterate that when it comes to accessibility, that I'm very accommodating. And you know, I've had a very recent meeting with Mayor Mood. I do know that there's another meeting that's planned in the weeks ahead with the mayor, with the warden, that I will be at. It will be at the Premier's office, and I pretty well know the agenda in advance. And again, I think in a case like this, Mr. Speaker, I think we've demonstrated our willingness to meet with the good people of Yarmouth, and we will continue to demonstrate that.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister responsible for immigration. Mr. Speaker, in the 2012-13 Statement of Mandate, the Office of Immigration set a target of 2,600 permanent residents to the province of Nova Scotia. Preliminary data from Citizenship and Immigration show we welcomed 2,370 permanent residents to Nova Scotia in 2012, which is short of the government's target that was set so recently. What's worse, Mr. Speaker, is that since this NDP government assumed power, we saw year-over-year decreases of new immigrants to our province to the tune of 8.6%, 1%, and 11.2% respectively. And Mr. Speaker, I'd be happy to table that chart just so that the rest of the members can see it as well. My question for the Minister responsible for immigration is, would the Minister please tell us why this NDP government, despite touting a brand new immigration strategy, is failing to meet the target that they have set for themselves?
The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, au contraire. We have exceeded our targets, Mr. Speaker, and to that point, we have, through the diligent work of the Premier, got it up to 700, Mr. Speaker. So, you know, we are working with immigrants coming into the province, Mr. Speaker. We are working closely with our federal counterparts in building our profile within the immigrant community and building that up, and it's a work in progress, and we're moving forward with it. Thank you.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm referring to the total number of immigrants. I think the minister is referring to the nominee numbers that were allowed, and the 200 he speaks to are for 1 year only. We were given an extra 200 to increase, so that's not a permanent increase, which again is unfortunate to meeting any of the goals that are outlined in the immigration strategy. The government has cut the international graduate stream, they cut the agri-food pilot stream, and the non-dependent child stream has also been cut, all because, according to a 2012 Chronicle Herald story, the federal government was irked that these streams existed and perhaps duplicated. I'll table that as well, Mr. Speaker, for the minister's benefit. Mr. Speaker, we're seeing more and more of this government ceding its own provincial responsibility to the Harper Conservatives, and, Mr. Speaker, no good will ever come of that. But absolutely. But that's not all we see. We see cuts as well. There's also been a cut to the immigration budget this year. Could the minister please indicate whether the cut in the budget, in addition to our cuts in the provincial nominee streams, is an admission that the NDP government has failed when it comes to immigration?
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm chuckling, but this is a serious matter. Speaker, you know, one thing this government has done is in a very positive way, is look at our record on retention, Mr. Speaker, where it's really at. That's what it is. We're retaining more immigrants than ever before, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, the one thing that questioner came awful close to me in agreement is that the cuts have happened, but the cuts are kind of beside her there. It's the federal government that's doing the cuts, not the province. Thank you.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that the NDP government has ceded parts of our provincial nominee program to the Harper Conservatives, and then they're using this uploading to justify a budget cut. We all agree that in this House that immigration is important, and I think we can all agree that this NDP government has failed in their aims in immigration. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to note that this NDP government has tied its immigration strategy to its failed Jobs Here strategy, which speaks volumes. Mr. Speaker, given that we need to increase the number of permanent residents by over 50% in the next 2 years in order to meet the goals that are set out in the immigration strategy, would the minister please tell us how this target will ever be achieved?
Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, with all due respect to the member, she's confusing federal responsibilities and provincial responsibilities, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are doing a tremendous job in attracting and retaining. And, Mr. Speaker, the member has only look in her own constituency. I would say it's probably one of the most diverse right now, with new immigrants teeming into that constituency, and it's proof positive that our immigration policy is working and we're retaining. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, the Heating Assistance Rebate Program is an important program, one which many Nova Scotians rely on to assist them through the cold winter months. However, this program has been underspent for the several years. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations tell the House if Nova Scotians were able to access a full budget allotment for this program in this fiscal year?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Yes, they were able to access it.
The honourable member for Preston on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP has no problem spending millions of dollars on political advertising. Communications Nova Scotia costs have tripled over the past few years, and yet the minister can't seem to get the word out about the important program. We are hearing from Nova Scotians who had previously accessed this program that they did not receive the automatic notification and forms which the department promises. Mr. Speaker, will the minister tell the House how many Nova Scotians were not sent notifications and forms this year and why that didn't happen?
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I think that this question I have answered once a year for 3 years. The member opposite, I would think, would be aware, because his office actually should have received the applications that all MLAs receive to give out to their constituents. If anybody is coming in there looking for an application, they should be able to get it from him. And if he's had people contacting him because they want to get on the program, what is he doing with those applications? Maybe he just might want to say, I have one here in my office. We get about in the range of 50,000 people who make use of the program. It could be 53,000 this year. And for everyone who has used the program in the past, we mail out an application form to them. We mail out an application form to them, Mr. Speaker. We send those applications to a wide variety of non-governmental organizations. They're available at our access centres. All the MLAs get them. We promoted this program through the media, Mr. Speaker. There may be another program that's promoted more widely through government. I can't be sure what that would be, but certainly, his question was, who has not received it? Well, there's 900,000 Nova Scotians. About 50,000 people get it. Do the math.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Natural Resources. As many in this House would know, we are just a few short weeks from the start of lobster season off the Cape Breton community of Manadoo. The MV miner ran aground in September of 2011 on land owned and protected by the province of Nova Scotia. At the time, the land is owned and protected by the province of Nova Scotia. At the time, the Premier said, and I quote, "If there's an impact on those fishing grounds, that's going to hurt us." It's now 19 months later. My question to the minister is, what news does the minister have for the people of Manadoo regarding the removal of the MV miner from the protected shores of Scattery?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly we understand the concern that's in the community of Gabiroos and the Cape Breton area, and we recognize the fishery is an important component of the economy in that beautiful area. And certainly we've been working with the community over the months since this unfortunate grounding occurred. And but we've had communications not only with the community but also with the federal government, and certainly we've made our position very clear all along that the federal government has full responsibility under the Canada Shipping Act to remove that wreck from the shores of Cape Breton, and we're going to continue our dialogue with the federal government, with the community. We very much as anybody want to see that ship removed from the Gabiroos area.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to inform the minister that it's the community of Manitou where this ship is, not the community of Gabiroos, as he replied to me twice in his question. The people of Manitou and area have been patient. The Community Development Association... Well,
yeah, that's why you don't know.
I mean, the fact is the ship is off of Manitou. It's not off of Gabiroos. That's not my fault. He should know that. Mr. Speaker, the people of Manitou and area have been very patient. Also have the people in Gabiroos, but that's another story. The Community Development Association worked with the Bennington Group and with the government. The fishers of the area worked with the government and the Bennington Group as well, and there's still no resolution. The Development Association in Manitou called a summit for January the 22nd of this year. Can the minister tell the residents of Manitou and surrounding areas, indeed all Nova Scotians, why he did not attend this meeting in the community for which he had ample notification, and when will he meet with those people?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I apologize for my geographical error. I know the actual ship is on the shores of Scattery, certainly near Manitou for sure. But again, we've worked with the community. We were prepared. My deputy minister and several other staff were available on January 22nd to attend the meeting there with the community. Then it got cancelled at the last minute. Unfortunately, my schedule didn't allow that to fit into that day. But we had lots of staff, including right up to the deputy minister, were fully prepared, and we continued the dialogue with the community and with the stakeholders, including the Arvina Navigation, the ship's owner, who has a full responsibility to remove that wreck from the shores of Scattery, and with the tugboat owners, and certainly with the federal government. We're going to continue to work to find a workable solution here on the shores of Scattery.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The community of Manitou has been patient, and the Premier said in October in a Canadian press story, and I quote, he said a lot more than you'll ever say.
He gets to speak. He's allowed to speak.
We don't want to allow it to languish over questions of who is responsible for it. It is not good enough to simply pass this back and forth. I'm not ruling out anything, including taking on the job if necessary. And Mr. Speaker, I've tabled that. It's 19 months later, this issue is still being passed back and forth. Another lobster season, Mr. Speaker, is upon us, and there is still no resolution. The community has waited long enough, Mr. Speaker. They have turned the corner and hit a brick wall. My question to the Premier, when will the Premier finally live up to his own words and help these fellow Nova Scotians who took him at his word?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think he needs to reread those words. We said we're not going to pass it back and forth because we recognize that it is the responsibility of the federal government. And it is an extraordinary amount of money that would be taken out of other responsibilities that we already have, Mr. Speaker. This is a matter that should be dealt with, and I have raised it many times. And the member knows, because the member traveled with me to see the federal minister, along with the member from Glace Bay, and along with our minister, in order to identify for the federal minister the responsibility that they had in relation to what we consider to be a very serious matter. So the question I have is simply this: when, I have no idea when, but when will the federal government actually live up to its responsibility with respect to this? I know that this, Mr. Speaker, is a touchy question for the member because he supports the federal government, but nonetheless, he should set aside his partnership and work on behalf of the people of Manitou.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Minister of Transportation when it comes to the Fitch Road in my constituency, that is a dirt road that leads into the wonderful hydroponic tomato operation run by Denhans, when they can expect to see that road paved.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure, Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the the Leader of the Opposition for his question. I would, if the road is not listed.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. I will now recognize the Government House Leader to call government business.
Mr. Speaker, I wish you'd now leave the chair in the House to resolve itself to the whole House on supply.
Motion is carried. We will now take a short recess to allow the minister's staff to come into the chamber and set up for the Committee of the Whole House on Supply.